Can Islamic feminism and secular feminism genuinely coexist in Pakistan?
I also feel that the slogans, especially the controversial ones, were the best part about it. Are we going to pretend that this is not feminism? It has not just a different methodology. It's anti-feminism wearing the language of female agency.
Over the years, internal divisions have also emerged within the Aurat March movement itself.
When the PTI women become politicized, we're hugely critical of it, right? The liberal and the opposition, those who are politically opposed to the PTI. I don't like women defending men, let's put it this way, or male politics.
Feminism in Pakistan is dominated by urban, English-speaking elites who remain disconnected from the realities of working-class women in rural communities.
That tells us something important about how patriarchy reproduces itself through women's own consent, okay?
Over the next 2 decades, are you optimistic, truly optimistic, that Pakistan will gradually move towards greater gender equality and social inclusion? Hello and welcome to another episode. Today we have with us Afia Zia, who is a Pakistani feminist, researcher, writer and activist based in Canada. She is the author of Faith and Feminism in Pakistan and several published articles on women, secularism, and religion. She's also an active member of Women Action Forum. Assalamu alaikum, ma'am.
Assalamu alaikum, Raesa.
Thank you so much for joining. Our debate will largely be today on your book and about feminism and the feminist movements in Pakistan over the years. My first question to you is that in your book, Faith and Feminism in Pakistan, you examine the tension between faith-based feminism, faith-based activism, and secular feminism. Can Islamic feminism and secular feminism genuinely coexist in Pakistan?
So I think, the politically correct answer is to say yes, they can coexist and each has a role to play and we need all the feminisms. But, 25 years and more of my involvement with the women's movement in Pakistan, I have really found that the answer is not intellectually honest when it is in its applied form, when you apply it, right? And the way to examine this is that you have to look at the activism itself, the campaigns. And those I find when I studied these, that the ones who are working within the politics of piety, right? Within the Islamic feminist framework, they actually either led or they spearheaded campaigns which have not challenged patriarchy in a structural sense, yes? So, when you think about it, have any of these movements campaigned against forced marriages, which is a big question in Pakistan? Have they campaigned against the denial of inheritance, equal inheritance to women, or against domestic violence? They do so in a very limited way when they do it, but that is not the feminism part is not as strong as the Islamic part, right? And if you look at the way it's practiced in Pakistan, the main core idea of the politics of piety is that women's empowerment comes from more religious observance, right? From more modesty and from more anchoring of our identity in Islamic practice, right? So this functions again and again as a support structure for masculine anti-feminist politics, right? And the biggest example, Raisa, is really, if we look today, has been the Haya March, right? The anti-Aurat March or the oppositional march to it. Here you saw women are mobilized. They are, they are a movement. We are not going to say they're not a women's movement, but their central political demand is that other women should be covered, should be more modest, should be confined to a patriarchally approved femininity. Okay, so are we going to pretend that this is not feminism? It has not just a different methodology. It's anti-feminism wearing the language of female agency, right? Of course, it's female agency, but towards what end? And I think the tragedy is that many of the women who are participating in it, of course, they experience empowerment, okay? But this empowerment is for patriarchal ends, as I've said. It's not for feminist transformation of class, of gender, of ethnic inequalities. Have you ever heard these concepts coming out from these politics of piety? No. And that tells us something important about how patriarchy reproduces itself through women's own consent, okay? It does not mean that it's making politics, feminist politics. And then, okay, so this is within Pakistan, but if you look at the geographical dimension also, right? Islamic feminist and Islamist adjacent women's politics spaces in Pakistan have shown consistent solidarity with Iran recently, okay, with the Islamic Republic of Iran. This is very interesting because, as a model of Muslim women's empowerment, this is the example of a state that carries Islamic values in public life, okay? But when
Yes.
feminists rise up in Iran, where were these Islamic feminists, or, when they burned their hijabs or they faced execution? So, the Islamic Republic reveals itself as a machine for systematic violent subordination of women and sometimes minority. So where is that solidarity then? It evaporated. So I mean, my argument is, of course, it's a movement, but its solidarity is never really with women. It's a certain vision of an Islamic statehood, which is a very different thing. Okay, and then to say things will trickle down for women. And then we can go into where was this solidarity with Palestine when it was an anti-colonial movement. But Palestine has its own. It's not a feminist political compass for Islamic feminists, which is very strange, right? Yes, victimhood, yes, solidarity, but not political activism. So the main point is that the vision of Islamic political power within Islamic feminist or the politics of piety, women's political piety, women's
Mm.
liberation is not the North Star, okay? And this is not to say that women of faith, Muslim women of faith, can't be feminists. Of course they can. But my point is that the politics of piety as a political program, right, differs to the argument that Islamic revivalism and women's modesty and that we should be deferring to religious authority. These are the paths to women's emancipation. This has not proven to have a credible record in Pakistan. It's consistently they end up on the side of patriarchal state power, or on the side of clerical authority over women's bodies at the expense of women's, the cost is the on of women's lives and women's oppression, and the priority of the politics of piety is women's roles is to perform Islamic virtue, not to demand their rights, not to demand equal rights. Okay, that's the key problematic with the thing, and this whole notion of let's not set up binaries. But the fact is that these are very oppositional or different bodies. We shouldn't try and stuff them into one category called feminism with a different shade. Okay, sometimes when they are anti-feminist, it needs to be called out.
Okay, very well said. If we look at the history, how deeply did Muhammad Zia-ul-Haq's Islamization policies reshape gender relations, women's rights, and public morality in Pakistan? Because many people, even today on social media, they argue that the restrictions associated with the Zia era are often exaggerated. They point to figures such as Nazia Hassan and Noor Jahan as well, as the continued existence of film and drama to suggest that society was not as heavily restricted as critics claim. So, how would you place these arguments in historical perspective, particularly regarding censorship, gender segregation, and the broader cultural atmosphere of that period?
So you said it yourself, if you're going to um, write history on social media, there's a problem right there, okay? And I think, well, I'll say that this argument is a form of cherry picking, historical cherry picking. And so the methodology is wrong. The method of reaching this, how you can't do this stuff on social media and, not cite sources, or you've not been part of that historical period. There's only two ways to write history, I think. But so the conclusion I would say is wrong, the thing is that Zia-ul-Haq and that time period didn't eliminate culture overnight. You can't, erase culture like that. But what it did was it systematically narrowed down the conditions under which women, for example, could participate in the public. And that narrowing down was supported with a narrowing down of laws, or the culminate or the layering up of anti-women laws, and it was institutional, it was structural, and it was enforced in everyday life. Okay, let's not pretend, because so everything was not documented as it is today because the nature of media has changed. It was not so quick, and but this is a myth to say that these were only symbolic, or they were, somehow benign, or they weren't really bans. Okay, that's, I think, a huge discredit and a distraction, because the fact is that there were lots of debates happening. We just haven't recorded all of them or not documented. There was a lot of discourse. Each one of these debates demeaned and actively cast women as lesser citizens, okay, and as suspicious citizens. That's very important because we were always sexually suspect, right? That's why the zina law had a tremendous impact in that regard. And we were, the law of evidence, for example, said women were very untrustworthy as providers of evidence. Now, both of these laws were not always implemented on every woman and constantly, but the fact that there were structural sort of swords hanging over women meant that the broader discourse of distrust and accepting women as lesser citizens, even lots of men bought into this, like even liberal progressive men, not giving inheritance, etc. So it created a certain atmosphere, right? These kind of policies, even if they were not enforced, even if they were not official bans, and gender social relations were redefined. Okay, so this sent out a signal. And so the artists that you mentioned, Nazia Hassan, etc., yes, they survived, but without sycophancy perhaps. But this is a tribute to their resilience. They survived despite Zia-ul-Haq, not because of him. And the censorship during Zia was very real, and it's documented. This debate about films and theater was banned, for example, in Punjab. That is quite clear. Or people were harassed, or the press was definitely muzzled. And what happens is, Raisa, for example, coercive ways to do it is you don't give them an NOC, right? Many things that we applied for as women dance, etc., you were not given an NOC. So when that happens, it shuts down one side of the women's movement or one side of women's expression, and it started giving rise to the politics of piety. Women not just women but men as enforcers of morality. They got a bigger. So this, you can't have one narrow view perspective. Oh, there was not a ban. Bottom line, there was a certain climate of fear that was created, and the state was underwriting and supporting its own politics of piety. So, sports, women in sports, okay, there was no official ban, but there was no funding. And you don't need to ban it if there's no funding. You just take away the oxygen and you stamp something as Islamic, right? And this is Islamic gendered roles. It's not appropriate, and it pretty much banned. So I think to younger people and those making these comments or half comments, really you have to read history and documentation and cite it, because structural harm is quieter, it's more insidious, and it's more
Yes.
durable, right? And it undermines the resistance politics. What this kind of commentary does is it doesn't account for, it doesn't document the resistance that was coming about and the sacrifices that were made by many. And I'll tell you, the main reason is, as you said, social media. Because back then, I mean, I wasn't that old enough to sort of to give you examples from it, but I can tell you that activism then was not personality driven. Okay, it was through collectivism, where the leaders were anonymous or the sacrificers were anonymous. Political activists were not celebrities as they are now, and I think that makes a big difference, right? Historians weren't celebrities, political activists weren't celebrities. So you don't get very clear examples of the sacrifices and the resistance that was made, because it was done through collectivism, which I think is a pity. But you rewrite history this way. But I think I don't agree with this analysis at all.
Okay. So coming to the contemporary times, the Aurat March has become one of the most visible feminist movements in Pakistan, yet it also generates backlash,
Hmm.
intense backlash.
Hmm.
Given your long association with the feminist activism and organizations such as the Women's Action Forum as well, do you think the Aurat March has at times made strategic mistakes, particularly in its messaging, slogans, or confrontational style? That unintentionally strengthened conservative or clerical opposition.
Well, I think I'll start the other way. I'll say I think that the Aurat March got a lot of stuff profoundly right. It put feminism back on the streets. I've said that repeatedly. When NGOs was,
Mm.
it was the movement was retreating into NGOs. I think Aurat March triggered it back, or pushed it back onto the streets. That's a huge contribution. And it made visibility, right? It made anger visible. It made frustration of against being confined to politeness, to polite advocacy, to working with the state, collaborating, which was a very Musharrafian aspect of the women's movement. And I've written much about it, that we got co-opted. The women's movement got co-opted by the lure of Musharrafian rights, etc. So I think this was a very important and timely rupture. I also feel that the slogans, especially the controversial ones, were the best part about it, right? I think there was needed to not because they were provocations, but they were diagnostic.
Mm.
These were they identified these symptoms of feminist responses, or of patriarchal oppression, things that were not discussed. Sexuality was not discussed by the prior wave of the women's movement. So it got a it triggered it. It wasn't deliberately provocative. It just mirrored the patriarchal anxiety that exists beneath the surface of Pakistani public life. That's what it is. It was truthful, right? And if it caused outrage, then the people who are outraged, they should examine their own, not sort of look at the uh, uh, accuse or allege that the person who's picking up the mirror is a problem. It's an evidence of a kind of a wound, or an anxiety within patriarchs. Anyway, so there is that. But yes, I have also written, you're correct, that the strategic question is very important, okay? Because you have two aspects. You have performance, you have activism, you have street politics, and sort of visibility, which is very important. But there has to be a strategy that informs you, and a solid kind of ideological base. And I think the cost of that, of the Aurat March's stress on performance, was that it overlooked or did not anticipate the idea of two fault lines, which, and particularly the religion fault line, right? I mean, one is the relationship with the state. The Aurat March did
Mm.
not have a strong vision about what its relationship with the state was going to be. So that's a problematic. The other is, of course, it was going to offend. I think they underestimated or did not anticipate how the religious right was going to take it, and therefore were not prepared for it. So strategically, it's very, very important. And that, but I think the good part was, at least in Karachi, where I was based, is that the dialogue between the older and the younger generation did take place much quicker than I think in some of the other cities, maybe in Lahore also. Um, and that conversation, or baton passing, or sharing of experiences between an older and younger generation. There are always some within who are more angry, or don't want to have that conversation, or generational differences, or competitiveness. The feminist movement is a movement just like any other. But in my bias, I think it's a better movement, and it's a more uh, sort of has more promise, and is more comprehensive and intersectional than any other movement. But I think we have competing identities, and sometimes get caught up in the kind of normative competitiveness of politics, which slows us down. But yes, I think my only disappointment now is that slowly, I've argued this, is that the Aurat March, in some ways, it's more solid, it's more routine, it's not giving up, which is hugely admirable. But I do see that its main purpose of bringing sexuality as a core principle and as a core
Mm.
contradiction has diluted a lot, because so it's retreated, and it's physically even retreated in some cities. I think that's a pity. And I think, just to be defensive about it, I think those who are defensive about it, rather than getting into the debate and having a genuine discussion, hold up the movement much more. But fortunately, generationally, feminists, you have both kinds. So I think that, this I look forward to both of these things combining back into the women's movement, into the Aurat March in the future also. But they have to have a plan, a strategic plan, on how to deal with the Haya March. You can't depend on the state all the time, and then expect. You have to resolve these two fault lines.
Over the years, internal divisions have also emerged within the Aurat March movement itself. In some cities, for example, the movement remained centered primarily on women's issues, while in others, it expanded into broader conversations around gender and sexuality, including LGBTQ rights as well. Do these ideological differences reflect a deeper debate within Pakistani feminism about whether oppression is primarily gender based or class based?
Not enough, but yes, the debate. Actually, it's not a debate whether it has been either gender-based or class-based. But yes, I think the critique has been that it's not. Because of the NGOization of the women's movement, the critique was that they don't deal with the class question enough. It's not political enough. That's a genuine. That was a genuine concern many of us raised. But there were always. Sort of more left-oriented feminists in Women's Action Forum, etc., and even in Sindhyani Tehreek, for example, Marxist feminists in the field, with whom this conversation was taking place. I think yes, it's this kind of Well, actually, in a way, it is a good thing because what these kind of debates reflect that there are more feminists in the game. I think that's important. For me, the biggest shift, if you ask me, that I've seen is that, we used to talk about feminism and we're always accused as being elitist, about westernized,
Mm.
about discussing issues that didn't matter in Pakistan. We can't be, feminism is a Western concept, etc. That's a sort of history now. Okay, now younger
Mm.
generations proudly claim themselves. Left movements, um, people, celebrities are debating whether they are not feminine. This is a huge breakthrough. Okay, so yes, I think feminism, gender relations does have more discussion than an interrogation and study than class relations. And I think that's a little, it's these are not mutually exclusive concepts. Feminism is about class differences, and solidarity with women, working class women, and seeing the patriarchal oppressions, the multi-layered patriarchal oppressions on working class women, which is both gender-based and class-based, etc. So these are intersectional, what are called intersectional debates. Um, yes, they are debated a little bit, they are discussed a little bit, but I again, like, it's social media is not the place for it. Twitter is not the place for it. What's happened is that unfortunately a lot of discussion has reduced down to a very loose discussion about liberal feminism versus radical, the more radical left feminism. Again, like I mentioned earlier, this kind of competitiveness I don't think is very useful. These identities should be discussed in visionary ways, as theoretical academic concepts, as ideological concepts. And you know that
Mm.
I've written often that I don't think this working, the role of male allies in women's movements, whichever side, of the spectrum they may be, is to me a huge obstacle because there's a lot of push and pull going on over there. And I'm wary of that. This is why I prefer all women's collectives to discuss these issues, because I think male allies, or men of certain of any ideology bring in their own agendas and gatekeeping in this progress. And that has been a critique of mine for some chapters of the Aurat March as well. I don't like women defending men,
Mm.
let's put it this way, or male politics, let's put it this way.
Okay. So you have just mentioned about this, and critics also argue that feminism in Pakistan is dominated by urban English-speaking elites who remain disconnected from the realities of working-class women in rural communities. So, how can feminist movements become more inclusive and representative of women from marginalized social, economic, and regional backgrounds?
Yeah, I mean, this is also misstated and misunderstood. Feminists can be of any class. Feminists can be of any ethnicity. Okay, feminism is about fighting patriarchal order, right, and fighting a gendered order that is premised on the benefits and the privileges of patriarchy. So, of course, there are feminists who have been fighting before without the term feminism or the label feminism. So, this
Yeah.
is a huge myth, and my whole book, as you mentioned, is about showing how working classes are working class politics and working class resistance is secular when it doesn't use religious props, when it doesn't use religion or divinity as its aim or goal or its ideology. What do we call it? I mean, I've said that's secular resistance. And secularism is not atheism. We've debunked that myth also. It's not to say that religion is false or that religious people are wrong. It's the institutional, legal, and personal principle
Mm.
that the state must not use coercive power or enforce any religion or use religion to say that citizens of all faiths are not equal. Okay, or no, we're not equal before the law, minorities are lesser. This the governed people must have the state must listen to the people's voices, to the consent of the governed, and not from some divine mandate. Now that's a problematic because Pakistan's constitution has a divine mandate, but that has been my objection about it. Okay, so this is a myth that feminism is not is something that is imposed from top down. I would argue to you it's a bottom up thing. We saw so many, sort of so much oppression, and we saw how feminism resists that, and those women become activists and become we collect them, make them part of the collective. We, solidarity is about bringing people of the same ideology or the same kind of survivors and victims together to fight for their equal rights. And secularism is important for women because in the absence of a secular legal framework, let's put it that way, which version of religious law applies to women becomes a weapon, right? Because religion
Mm.
is sort of nebulous. It's not an airtight, watertight law in that sense, Islamic laws. So the contention is that at least with secular law you can question it. You can there's not too many interpretations about it, right? And it's more stable. It's a more stable method or channel for delivering women's rights, people's rights, citizenship's rights. Now, if you want a clear-cut contrast, you just have to look at Afghanistan today under the Taliban, right? You even see in Iran, that they use religious laws to systematically eliminate women's equality and women from public life. I know there's a lot of discussion about how women work. This is also a very male argument, how women work in Iran. The fact is, Iran's labor force, female labor force participation is nearly half that of Pakistan's. So, we need to look at this. These are very easy things to post on social media. They're incorrect, they're misleading. And you have to also see what kind of jobs who are they serving in when you're in state public life, right? Um, and what are feminists asking for in these countries? That should be our guiding light. Okay, so yes, I think secularism also matters for religious minorities, for vulnerable citizens. When the state interprets one religion as the source of law, and it privileges one gender or one religious identity over the others, that's not an equal state. And then we have to look for alternatives that can um, that can deliver a more equal principle, more equal
Mm.
equality overall. And no, I don't agree that this is a Western concept. Are we saying that we're incapable of equality or that it's not desired in our tradition, our history, our sort of historical legacy? I don't accept that.
Okay. So, despite stronger legislation, increased media attention, and growing public awareness as well, gender based violence remains deeply pervasive in Pakistan. It is deeply rooted till date, even in every class. And if you had to identify the three most important reforms needed to challenge patriarchal mindset in Pakistan, what would they be? Just three.
Well, I won't even give you three, I'll give you one, because I've always argued to the question you asked earlier about class. If you center class as your point of vision or your central point of analysis, then of course economic autonomy for women becomes the key over here, right? And this requires structural intervention, and it affects the other things. It affects secular perspectives. It affects legal. It brings in all of those points. So, for example, inheritance law reform and enforcement is needed, right? I mean, really, you can't. The inheritance laws cannot be driven by the Sharia law. It has to be reformed. It has to be very categorical, and you can't leave it to people's choices. This is not going to work, right? I've also said on a more policy basis, equal access to formal banking, right? I've said this before, just bank accounts, that there's a major drive in India. Pakistan has one of the fewest, sort of low numbers of women's access to banking. All of these give you autonomy. Religion, piety, and all of these performative things don't deliver actual rights. We have to fight for them regardless of what your belief is, right? There has to be recognition for unpaid and domestic work. That's also, this informal sector is like very,
Yeah.
very problematic for women. And basically, women who are economically dependent on men because the state has made it so, these structures in these laws have made it so, they have no exit. Right. So
Mhm.
that this cycle of oppression and sort of economic empowerment is so closely tied to each other. The legal remedies are only when come later, right? We need to fix this within. Economic alternatives have to be provided. I'm not saying that it leads, but there's a connection to violence. There's a connection to education. Women who are more educated tend to be stand for their rights more, etc., etc. So there's that, and to any other example or any other remedy or any other reform that people would say, we need to have a simultaneously instituted accountability mechanism. So we always fight against, the judiciary or the law, because the state and institutional actors do not give justice, right? And their own
Hmm.
biases and their own um, interest in saving men, murderous men, violent men, that has to be dismantled. I mean, I know we say that law doesn't, doesn't is not going to trickle down. Law doesn't solve the problem, but the fact is they can't be on the side of the perpetrator. At least, that part has got to be dismantled. Whether it's the police, whether it's judges, whether it's community leaders, political leaders, and I think we see a shift in this. Again, a new generation holds these people to account, even if it's on harassment, even if it's on the Me Too movement, even if it's on victim blaming and things that they do via social media. Those are also important because they chip away at this impunity, social impunity. But all I'm saying is, along with the social reputational impunity that we must challenge, we need to do the structural work also. We need to engage with the state and reform the state as well. And criminal accountability is key in this.
Okay, very, very well said. My last question is that over the next 2 decades, are you optimistic, truly optimistic, that Pakistan will gradually move towards greater gender equality and social inclusion? Or do you believe that the political resistance, religious conservatism, and entrenched patriarchal structures will continue to slow down the meaningful progress?
I'm not, I wouldn't say optimistic or pessimistic, but I'm stubbornly realistic. So I think there are grounds for hope. I think I've said this repeatedly. There are more women in public spaces than when I was growing up in Pakistan. That's a huge change, right? And it's an important change. And now your generation takes it for granted, which is fantastic. That's why you say that, you can't imagine a time when this was not so, when women weren't in the media, when women, could dress the way, whatever you've overcome a kind of a restriction that my generation grew up with. Women, there are more women engineers, there are women in the nuclear program, there are women pilots, judges, entrepreneurs, all the rest of it. So the scale is important, right? The feminization of spaces, the feminization of the institution, and the feminization of politics and the state is critically important. Feminization of police is very, very important. And the women's movement, as I said, the Aurat March, etc. I think once they are manage the fault lines, I think that they and sort of the bridge between the older women generation of feminists and the younger one is crossed or is merged. I think that will solidify the women's movement also, and mobilization. But there is one new challenge which I think is important, and I'm not quite sure how we're going to deal with that, which is that women's political agency, if you notice, it's come up in unexpected places. Yes, parliament, yes, state. But recently, the Pakistan Tehreek-e-Insaf, the PTI's rise, and the mobilization of middle class and middle class and even elite women who are not feminists necessarily, but who have demonstrated a politicization. I think that's important. And I think we allow our biases to come in too much, because it's so interesting. We'll accept the politics of piety, we accept the politics of right-wing women, okay, and we sort of genuinely try to engage with it. But when the PTI women become politicized, we're hugely critical of it, right? The liberal and the opposition, those who are politically opposed to the PTI. And I understand it, because, like my criticism for right wing women, that it's not a feminist politics, my critique of the PTI politics is not just feminism, is not just women coming in for one male leader or sacrificing for one male leader or whatever. But but there is something to be said about women who come out and challenge the state, challenge the military, all the things that we have diagnosed as problematic. You can't dismiss that as saying, oh, this is just for manipulation by Imran Khan's charisma. I think that's patronizing. It's analytically wrong. I think these women are exercising political judgment. How do we steer this political moment or political constituents or women, politicized women, towards a feminist end, right? I don't think you can disagree with them. You can disagree with it, but I think there's potential over there that we must not dismiss for the long term, if you have a long term vision. And it's important to engage with those who have potential rather than those who are clearly oppositional to you. So I find this a very strange moment. Like I said, I find this strange. I find the discussion about erasing or making women's issues secondary to imperialism politics, I think these are challenges on how we overcome and how we forefront and prioritize our feminist and gender identities, so that it influences other politics and carries over and influences and trickles down and strengthens the other aspects of our political being, our political consciousness, not to lose our gender identity, but forefront it, and prioritize it. I think that's going to be a key challenge and a key um, something to watch out for, to realize what direction the feminist movement is going to go in next.
Okay, ma'am, thank you so much for enlightening
My
our
pleasure.
audience. I guess that this topic needs to be discussed much more often than it usually, it's not in debate usually.
Agreed, absolutely. I think the debate has become, sort of, this is also a legacy of the depoliticization of Zia's
Yeah.
time, that debate is a bad thing. And,
Mm.
and then social media debate became so toxic and so personalized, a whole generation.
Mm.
But, the Gen Z generation, I think that they've got a better handle on many things, and we need to pay attention to that and see how things are shifting on the ground.
Yes. Thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure. Thank you, Raisa.